long and difficult, just make it short. Yeah, then once we've said our names, then I'll give you instructions number two. Great, let me start with myself. Winnie. So the good thing with this game, you don't even need anyone to interpret your name, so we are safe. So let's do another round. Winnie. Good. So the game goes like Winnie, Winnie, Sandy, Sandy. So I'm trying to, Sandy, help me. So let's do this. Start your time. Then you have to keep the rhythm, yeah? Winnie, Winnie, Sandy, Sandy. Then you start with Winnie and then somebody else. Okay. Yeah. It can be, it doesn't have to follow the line. Okay. Well, that's not on the panel. That's not on the panel. Okay. We don't, we're not going in order. You say anything. We're going in order. We can play in order so that we remember. Yeah? Okay. How about we're bad with the names? How about we're bad with names? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you last why there's a punishment. Okay. Another round of names to say. Sammy. Winnie. Hannah. Gabby. Siwe. Okay. Yeah. That's why it's easy to be random. I know that. Follow the line. Okay. Okay. I forgot. Okay, one more final round. Now we start with that side. You're the one who will set us up. Abby. Thank you. Thank you so much. If we still have time afterwards, we will try and play it again. So if we can try and just all sit nearer to the front, that would be good. For the guys at the back, since we are a small room. Um, yeah, and to my great panel, please take your seats. Great. Thank you once again for joining us for this conversation. My name is Winnie Kabinti. governments to account and agitate for change. In Kenya, for instance, TikTok and Twitter, I still call it Twitter. So that's how you tell me you're a millennial without telling me you're a millennial. Yeah. So youth are leveraging social media platforms such as TikTok, X. In Kenya, TikTok particularly played a big role during the Reject Finance Bill protest, which was led by Kenya's Gen Z. Today we want to have a discussion on the impact of digital media on social movements and strategies that young people can employ to make these movements not just impactful, but sustainable. To help drive this conversation is a seasoned panel drawn from academia, media, research, and of course, to each one of you who joined us for this conversation today. So please allow me to allow my great panel to introduce themselves, starting from my far left. Mike. Looks like mine is the only one working.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Winnie, for guiding us to this point. My name is Richard. I'm a digital researcher. I'm the founder of Thraets. It's an initiative and a civic tech research lab based out of East Africa. My background is in computer science. I've spent the last 8+ years working in tech, big tech. Until recently, I was working at Twitter with the team until Elon Musk's shit show. But to step back to that, I've been studying the internet for over, I think now 15 years across sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm very excited to be part of this panel to have this discussion. So thank you so much for having me.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sandy Chimpala, and I run TechTrends Zambia, which is a tech media and events company. So for the last 10 years now, well, since 2013, is it 11? I don't know, lose count. Yeah, so since 2013, we've basically been covering the digital and tech journey in Zambia and in Africa as a whole. Digital rights being one of the topics that we focus on as well, because we want to see how media freedoms are being carried out or expressed in other regions and how that compares to the situation in Zambia. So this is not my first Fifth Africa event that I've attended, but I think it's the second one where I get to speak, so it's always a pleasure for CIPESA to include TechTrends Zambia on their forum. So that's basically what we do. And now we move on to Dr. Nach.
Hello, Dr. Nwachukwu Ebonike, Nwach for short. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Media and Communication, Pan-Atlantic University, Lagos, Nigeria. My research agenda straddles digital media, youth political participation, social movements, and digital authoritarianism. Prior to joining the academia, I was the regional editor for Global Voices, and I'm also currently a member of the board of directors of the African Digital Rights Network.
Thank you, Dr. Nwach. I'll actually start with you. What in your opinion is occasioning this rise in digital movements in the continent?
Basically, there are three things. First and foremost is what's most theoretical framework has been described as relative deprivation. There's so much pent-up anger. I'll give a typical example. Coming to FIFA, I arrived yesterday, and in the shuttle bus that took us, we are many other Africans, who are also coming to this event. And cut the story short, by the time it usually delves into politics, conversation entered into politics, and it's quite interesting because in the end, it's just basically the story of Africa told from different countries. Ineffably corrupt, genetic leadership, years of failed promises, and with everything piled up into it. So what has happened over years? There's so much pent-up anger, so much deprivation, so much misery. And this has, lasted over years and years, decades. So that's the first and foremost, the pent-up anger, the negative deprivations. And then secondly, this is a youthful continent. 60% are basically below 24 years or within that age range. But aside the demography, is that there's also a sort of ideal of what it now means to be young. They don't conform to the convention. They actually break the convention. They don't take no for an answer. They are fed up with all these failed leadership and everything, and they are not ready to wait for their time, and which was something that characterized perhaps my generation and generation before me. Oh, don't worry, things will get better, have hope, don't worry. No, they in sense of rattling the status quo. So first the anger, now have a large demography of young people who are both the demography and the ideal, and then you now mix that with the third point, which is that their media is digital media. It's not like my generation, that's migrated and had to adapt to how to use the email and stuff like that. This is their media. No gatekeepers, participatory, and precisely because of that, what you have and what you're going to be seeing for most part of the continent is a lot of social movements driven by young digital natives.
Absolutely. So Dr. Noach has mentioned that technology is largely one of the contributors of the rise of these movements in the country, and also the demographic of Africa's population, majority of whom are young people who are restless to see change and not contending with status quo. Sandy, do you agree with that? What is your position on this as a media advocate? What do you think is leading to the rise of the youth movements that we're seeing?
Firstly, pure frustration in our environments. And also, I think there's more demand for better systems, and the youth are the ones that kind of have to use the system. So if it's not working, then somebody has to say something, and it has to be the users. That's what's happening now. And also, given that, Dr. Noach already said, the majority of people that we have in most of these African countries, and in the world globally, I think are youth. So who else will speak on it, And also with the rise of digital technologies, there's ways that we need to operate. So the old ways that we used to do things won't match to the new and emerging technologies. So I think that's given a rise to, the demand for better services, for better systems in place as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. To you, Richard, the researcher, what does the research tell us? What have you seen in terms of the research maybe that you've done? Some of the things that, Salista and Dr. Noach have mentioned that you're not happy with some of the things happening. What are these issues that are making young people upset?
Absolutely. I think when you look at the stats, it's very clear that there is a very huge unemployment rate that is growing amongst educated youth. Of course, the likes of Nwachu have already shared with you the stats about the populations and the demographics in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at countries like Niger, Uganda, Nigeria, it actually goes further down, that almost 50% of the population is below the age of 15. So we are seeing huge dependency rates. If you look at the crowd, right? The attendees right now, almost everyone is supporting another individual within their families, within their networks. There's a lot of pressure among us, not only the youth, but also, parents and, different individuals in our, clusters and networks. So one, the huge unemployment rate is causing a lot of pressure among us, the youth themselves, and they want to give in. The second thing we are noticing also is around just the political situations in these countries. Take an example of Reject the Finance Bill demonstrations that we saw in Kenya. It was very clear that many of the proposals that were in this bill were really not in support of the many young people within Kenya. And of course, these are some of the reasons as to why they had to step out and push for their voices to be heard across. The same thing would be said around whether it was Nigeria with the NSAS movements. The brutality against many of the youth who were just going out of their way, going to work or coming from work, and the different abuses that we saw with the police and other security forces. These are two areas that I think were very important in some of these demonstrations to start.
Thanks, Richard. I like what you've shared, and I like that you've also given different perspectives from the movements that we've seen, or rather the uprisings that we've seen in different countries. So based on what you've seen in the continent recently, starting with the Kenya Rejects Finance Bill, NSAS, and the others, what can you say, what lessons can young Africans borrow from similar movements outside the continent in a way that will make these movements not just a one-time event, but bring a bigger long-term impact?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the Reject the Finance Bill demonstrations and protests that happened in Kenya, we noticed that there was a massive increase in arrests of the protesters. If there's anything we can borrow from the likes of the Black Lives Movement in 2022 or the George Floyd movements, it's just the use of digital security and digital communication, secure digital communication tools in some of the activities and the planning. A report was shared, or a finding was found by the researchers at Intercept and the Wired magazine. This was on a report around the FBI and how they surveilled many of the actors. And one interesting part in this report was the fact that the FBI struggled in finding any information around the leaders who had used some kind of private communication tools like Signal. So one methodology or point we can borrow from such movements would be the use of digital securities in the organization or the planning. It's also clear that basic digital hygiene, the likes of two-factor authentication, the use of stronger passwords, use of VPNs, use of Tor browsers for anonymity is very important. And these are some of the things that we saw from the report. The other idea that we could borrow from some of the protests that we've seen across the world, in 2019, what happened in Hong Kong was that there was a proposal that was tabled to have the Hong Kong citizens be extradited to mainland China. Now what this led to was a massive organization and protest that we saw with over 2 million people going to the streets for some of the demonstrations. One of the lessons we learned from the Hong Kong protests that led to the success is what they call the be water methodology. And this was borrowed actually from one of the leading martial arts actors, I think, called Bruce Lee. And what this means, I'm going to explain it in just 30 seconds, is it's kind of a leaderless movement. Create a leaderless movement. Be water. Don't have a form. Be shapeless in some of your leadership. And the demonstration, the protesters in Hong Kong pulled this off perfectly well. If you look at some of the tactics they used in forming the different groups and the different locations in their demonstrations, it was something, that was coming out of the movies. If you look at the ways of organization using random websites that are hosted in different countries, what methodology that they used across, and that was really quite interesting to see. We need to think through the legal preparedness before we go into these demonstrations. And that's something we can borrow from the Black Lives Movement. In 2019, after the George Floyd, demonstrations, or during the George Floyd protests, what we clearly saw was the help of non-profit law organizations like the ACLU and many others coming in and preparing some of these folks, working with some of the leaders to just make sure that they were ready for some of the protests. I think that's very important. Of course, Kenya is another good example. We saw the LSK, Faith Ojambo, and her team also coming in and supporting many of the protesters with some of the legal challenges that they were facing. I will pause there for now, but I'm happy to have further discussions around that as we go on.
Thank you, Richard. Indeed, you touched on very critical areas of preparation, because we're talking about young people being very tech savvy and having access to these platforms. But for sure, one of the gaps that we can all see, or we know based on our local context, is just understanding of the legal frameworks surrounding these platforms, and also emerging trends of censorships. I remember when we had an issue with internet throttling during the Reject Finance Bill in Kenya. Some people were not even understanding that actually that was surveillance, People just thought, oh, internet is down. But now, as somebody who has this information, you're able to understand exactly what is happening. So I think it's also a call to different players, especially the civil society organizations, to intensify information literacy as far as navigating this. As I like to say, what you don't know cannot help you. I know also the role of, now that we are talking about digital media, we cannot downplay the power of influencers. Any influencers in the room? This one is for you. Yeah, so Sandy, what role can our social media influencers play to impact social movements positively?
All right, so, there's a lot of ways, I have my talking points here just so I don't digress. But with influencers also, just before I get started on the ways they can positively impact social media movements, not every influencer is a good influencer for some of your social media movements, obviously, based on the kind of content they produce. For example, you might have a comedian, and depending on the type of, humor that he or she creates, them being a part of the movement might make it comedic rather than actually bring to light the bigger issues that the movement is trying to push for or change. So I think one of them is basically that when you do have these influencers on board, as much as it might be a shapeless form of leadership online, right? You're trying to push a cause. Sometimes there has to be leadership that can tell them how best to push the agenda. So that's basically using their large followings, because that's what influencers are, is people with a large following, or at least with a following that they're able to influence. So they need to be aware of what the social movement is and be able to articulate it very well to their audiences for them to understand. So when they're following, for example, the hashtag, they are not confused because the information that's coming from their primary source, who would be the influencer is actually clear to them. And then secondly is collaborate with some youth leaders. So not all influencers are the typical influencer you think of in your head, you know, your lifestyle bloggers or your celebrities. Some of them are actually people who are youth activists and have a large following. So they may not be part of the I don't know if you can call it organizing committee of the social media movement, but you can engage those as well to use their following on digital platforms to be able to influence or even push for more advocacy or activism using their platforms and using their audiences as well to be an active part of the movement. Another thing is that the content that is being brought out must be authentic. It must be relatable to the different audiences that are followed by the people. People follow people for relativity. So if the things that you do, the life that you live, the conversations that you have are relatable to me, I will probably follow you. So that's what happens. That's why you get like all these different target audiences, because maybe someone is a football fan and they're always tweeting about all these football updates, you know, so they're quick to respond to some of the things that they talk about. I tweet about tech all the time. So there are people, it's a very niche conversation, so I have very specific followers who are following me for that. But sometimes these movements all have an overarching agenda, like it cuts across all kinds of industries, all kinds of people. So I think those are important, that when you're sharing this information or when you're sending out content and a call to action, it's actually very authentic data that is going out there. Then another thing is that what influencers come with is the power to mobilize brands and organizations that they work with. So me going to a brand like, you know, maybe I go to Dr. Nwaj, he may not be moved unless there's an influencer who goes to him and says, look, I have this following, we want to push this thing, and I'm already, you know, partnered with you in some way or another. So can we please form some sort of collaboration here where even the organizations and the brands that you as an influencer are aligned with are able to push the social movement online even further through the use of hashtags, or maybe by aligning themselves in line with their mission and values, because not every brand can align with every social movement, depending on what their interests are, of course. So there's an opportunity for some of the influencers that are pushing these agendas online to also get the brands and organizations that they are partnered with or that they are maybe brand ambassadors of to also push this movement even further. And then there's the importance of cross-platform sharing. So not all influencers work best on one particular type of social media platform. They have different levels of following, numbers of followers across different platforms. One might be good for TikTok, one might be good for Facebook, for Meta, another one might be good for X. So depending on that, you need to align with the influencers who have the most followings on different platforms, and then also create content that speaks to those different, the way they speak on those platforms might vary, but at least get the message across through them. So they, as influencers, would need to come on board and basically say which platform I think they get the most engagement or possible activism out of, and then create content that fits that particular platform. And then lastly is to advocate for policy change by mobilizing online support and directing it towards online action or even physical action. So they can use their platforms to basically mobilize for any call to action that the social movement is making. For example, if it's a petition to maybe open up the internet in a certain place, and there's an online maybe form to fill in or an online petition to do, it is very important that these influencers have access to those resources in terms of if there's links that need to be shared. They shouldn't just post a hashtag and leave out information. So they're able to actually move their audiences to the next possible action, which is either filling in a form, or is it directing people to meet somewhere to, you know, are we all wearing black when we go here? So all that information they should be able to share and accurately describe what exactly the call to action is required of this movement, because that's the information that even their followers, who might not be following the originator of any online activism of any sort, but they've seen it from the influencers that they follow, will be able then to get all that information and participate in a bigger movement.
Thank you, Sandy. Indeed, I think This is the part where if you're a Christian like me, you will say, to whom much is given, much is expected. So the social influencers need to do more, understanding the authority that they comes with their name and their platforms. So I have a general question to all of you, and this is just regarding the platforms that young people are using. Of course, they're leveraging on digital media platforms, they're tech savvy and all that, but also this is the same platform that governments are using to quash down their agendas. So how can young people navigate these spaces in a way that they are able to navigate, run away from surveillance, massive misinformation that is also being fueled by governments to try and bring about confusion? What is the best way? What strategies can young people employ? We can start with you, Dr. Nwach.
Many things comes to mind. First and foremost, I'll use concrete examples. The ability to focus on the message and not losing it midway is very, very important, because when disinformation starts, more often than not, is also precisely because the social movement gets carried away. Typical example was in 2012 Occupy Nigeria protests. Because the organizers were at a point so desirous to mimic the global Occupy movement, and also it was just at the heels of the Arab Spring, they were more focused on the spectacle, violence, and so on, to show the energy and so on and so forth. And not realizing that they just practically played into the hands of the authorities, who now use that as an excuse, of course, among other things, to squash the protest. So that's one. Focus on the message. And that's where the NSAS protests really did a lot. Not only did they focus on the message, it was a motive, and they did it on time. So that even when hooligans were unleashed, they were able to call the government out. So that's first. Secondly is also the responsibility of the platform themselves. And a typical example as well comes with, for instance, Twitter. Sorry, I still find it, I'm not the only one that still finds it difficult. Twitter under Jack, their response to NSAS protest was totally different to their response to the Ghana's Fix the Economy protest. In NSAS, Tweet under Jack created a special emoji. They as well raised money for the protesters, and that was one of the ways that it was very difficult for the government to stop the protests, because they really raised money and cryptocurrencies and so on and so forth. But flip the coin, when it was now Fix the Economy in Ghana, never in Ghana, Twitter of a sudden became very, very quiet. And so you could really see that the platforms themselves, we also have to hold them accountable, because more often than not, they are as well enablers, as well with government, of digital authoritarianism. So focusing on the message, and then not, I guess we might also maybe have to talk about that later. One thing is to start a mass movement, or to, what's it called now? The call to action, mass action. And that thing is to sustain the movement. And it takes quite a lot to sustain a movement. And that's now where, okay, a lot has to go into it. Being as well, how do I put it? Knowing full well that your governments don't change that much. The tactics are always the same. It's a tyrant manual that has been deployed for many years, and they just brush it up and keep on using it. So, of course, that also means that there has to be a little bit of structure, so to speak, that will help you as a movement, be not just a step ahead, but many steps ahead when the misinformation, disinformation. And fourthly, which always happens, is what researchers have called the Hooligan effect. So young people start a mass movement, they start protesting, they start calling out, and the authorities unleash hooligans to disrupt the protests, one, drive in fear, secondly, and then turn around to tell the world that, see these young fellows, they're just around causing violence, creating and destroying things, and so on and so forth. So it takes, of course, it's something that has been used. It was used in NSAS protests, it was used in Occupy Nigeria protests, and I guess as well, it was also, not I guess, it was actually used in End Finance Bill. So having the presence of mind, that's now where, okay, the thing of planning ahead already helps to drive your narrative. So focus on the message.
Indeed, focusing on the message. Sandy, what strategies can...
Yeah. So basically, I mean, this has been an issue online for, what's real and what's not, but I think one of the ways that this can be combated is to have, I would like to call them a response team within the movement as well, that's able to flag any misinformation about the movement online, right? A lot of these platforms have reporting tools, which are under scrutiny, and depending on where you are in the world as well, that's another factor. I mean, I'm in Zambia, so I know reporting can take a little longer sometimes, right? But at least if they're being flagged by multiple people, I think that obviously raises a red flag in the back. Is Meta in the room? Yeah, so I think to have a rapid response team that flags the misinformation is essential, but then also for other people who are able to see that this is, fake, or it's not very factual. It would be nice to have them also to use the tools that are online to report this misinformation, just so it's taken down a little quicker, and also counter that with the truth, so that people who are reading are able to see that engagement as well and see what the facts are compared to what was put out. Because it's very easy. I can create 3 pages today, and they're all just made to counter whatever it is trying to be done productively. So it's very easy to do that. And even if it's not, pages, people will use other channels. They'll go offline and use social messengers, and then that obviously reaches a larger market as well. And another thing is for youth as well that are online to try and tell their elders that some of the stuff they read is not real. Shout out to my mom and her forwarded many times messages. But they are one of the biggest disseminators of fake news or misinformation or disinformation. So it would be nice that we actually speak to the elders who are less savvy when it comes to using social media tools or online platforms and participating in this kind of discourse when it's not true. I mean, that would take, I don't know about your mothers, but that would take like 30 minutes arguing back and forth, but at least try. Yeah.
Richard?
One area that could come in very importantly is a number of the protesters will need to come up with some kind of dedicated teams that can pre-bank whether it's the disinformation or some of the misinformation that is ongoing. What we learn from the recent Kenya protests was very interesting. At the end of each day, we saw many of the protesters going onto X Spaces, I think formerly Twitter Spaces. I attended a number of these, and it was very interesting to hear them sort of fact-check some of the content also in their discussions. But you notice that that is too late. We need to think about how to pre-bank it quite earlier. On the issue of, being surveilled by some of these governments, currently what we notice in Kenya is they're grappling with a number of disappearances. Several protesters are nowhere to be seen. And the bigger question is, how has the government identified them? The point around anonymity and identity protection is now more important than before. We need, or they need, to go through some kind of, digital security trainings on how to create some kind of sock puppets online. Sock puppets is a fancy word for fake accounts that you can use. They need to come up with ways in which they can securely share their information amongst, one another. So this is what we need to understand. Governments use phishing and social engineering many times to arrest these guys. So take an example. If I know Nwachu, maybe owns a big coffee farm in Nigeria. What these operatives and intelligence guys do is they'll give you a call or give your family member a call and say, hey, we have a big business for Nwachu. Yeah, he's going to make millions tomorrow. Can we meet up somewhere and do business? Many of these governments are using these, social engineering tactics and phishing. Send you an email with some interesting title that will make you click on it and later on take over your account and find out more details about you. If you look at the Hong Kong protests, and this is where it was very interesting, I'll always be going back to the Hong Kong protests. One of the ways that they fought actually the physical side of surveillance was, if you clearly remember, almost all of them wore black t-shirts. Fine, it was just before, I think, the COVID time, and we saw them also wear masks in the protests. So it was very hard for many of these, surveillance, cameras and government to even track them physically. Another thing that we saw them do, and this is the more technical side of things that we haven't seen this part of the world and could also, help us. We saw them use the likes of laser beams. So for those of you who don't know, many parts of sub-Saharan Africa are now running with, I think, what they're calling the smart cities by Huawei. There are cameras around the cities. According to many researchers, some of them have AI facial recognition. So by many of these protesters in Hong Kong using those beams and flashing them around the cameras, they kind of disorganized and jumbled the AI facial recognition. And that's how they fought some of the surveillance across. But at the same time, some of the red and green beams also helped in affecting the photographic, being taken by the police and the organizations themselves. So there are many ways that we could see this go, but going back to disinformation itself, a major other tactic we see around disinformation during protests and how the government is using this is counter narratives, things like hashtag poisoning. So if you clearly remember, even during NSAS and Reject the Finance Bill, there are massive misspellings, massive additional keywords that people keep adding. And this is not by mistake, this is intentional by some of the counter activities that they set up. And I hope that as researchers, we can study many of these behaviors and come up with better solutions around this. Because disinformation around protests is dangerous because it goes to the point of doxing, where they show, the location of some of the actors or some of the police, and this can become dangerous and have real-world harms and effects in the long run.
Absolutely. So we're going to take a pause now and move a bit from the panel and open up the conversation to you. Does anyone? Abu Bakr. Was it Abu Bakr? Abdi.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, the panelists, for sharing this insightful information. I have 3 questions you can share among yourself. First is how digital media has transformed the landscape of youth social movements in Africa compared to previous generation, the traditional way of building movements back in the days before the internet? Is it much more impactful now, or it's less? And then also the issue of accessibility and inclusivity. When we're talking about digital media and social media, what are the barriers that young people in Africa are facing in terms of accessing digital media? If you can share, that can sometimes hinder their participation in this movement. And the final question is, what do you foresee in the future of youth social movements in Africa in relation to the evolving digital media, especially with AI and stuff and other technologies, the future? What do you think? I'll stop there.
So I was going to say, let's take several, then the panel answers. But since Abdi has done 3, let's answer that, and then we come back to you.
Okay, I'll take the first one, and then it's quite interesting because in my book that just came out this year, I try to give, at least within the Nigerian perspective of movements, going even before independence, and see how movements were formed, how they survived. You could really see the difference between post-colonial movements within Nigeria, and the twist that came with military dictatorship. And after military dictatorship, which in Nigeria lasted for almost 28 years, 30 years, and then democracy came in, and just as we are within that democratic space, opened up as well. Also, it coincided with the rise of digital technologies. And you can really see the stark difference between each of these epochs of social movement, the changes, social movements and the changes and everything that they pushed. But one thing that is certain is not to say, okay, of course, not to enter with this type of tech what's it called? The utopians that believe that, okay, all you need, and which was unfortunately the mistake or the leading idea at the start of the Arab Spring and so on, that just what you need, give a society technology and the democratic ideals are going to flourish and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, having said all that, you cannot just underestimate the influence, the push of digital media on social movements. And as I said initially, an introductory remark, now it's not just an issue of an impact, as if technology were something that stands on its own, you know, and then those who use technology also standing on their own. There has now been a fusion, and I think that's what is very, very important. And we've seen that happen in NSAS and in Reject the Finance Bill, of a generation of Africans that their primary media is digital media. So it's not as if they had to migrate, they had to find their way around the use of technology. That is almost the normal means of expression. And precisely because of that, what they can precisely do with it far outweighs, and they were able to record and still able to record a lot of mileage than their predecessors. So historically, there is. And part of the research that we conducted some years ago, actually within the Nigerian context, you could really see that those who are immersed, especially in political conversation, using digital medias over time, that spend at least an average of 5 to 8 hours a day, there is a direct correlation between that and offline political participation. So it's not just an issue of, okay, pressing phone, as we say in part in Nigeria, or just activism. No, it now goes much more than that. That it pushes, and the political participation, where you also have to realize that it is in two forms: the online political participation and the offline. And more often than not, as we are rightly seeing, the offline political participation has a direct correlation and impact on offline political participation. So much so that even mainstream media are now catching up. So it has changed the dynamics. Having said that, that does not mean that, okay, we'll fall back to the same tech utopianism that we started with at the start of blogging and so on and so forth. There are challenges, and those challenges are also peculiar to this sort of age as well.
I'll tackle the last question. Later on, maybe remind us about the second question. The role of AI within the protests in the future, right? My team has been studying the current use of AI, not only in elections, but also around the recent protests. One interesting thing that we've seen is, I think protesters are also excited about having crowds. One of the common images you're going to see online around protests that are made with many of these Gen AI tools is just to show you crowds. And we've been documenting a lot of this. So just like many of the other conversations around the use of artificial intelligence and specifically Gen AI around this, is we are going to see the ease of bad actors using this for disinformation. Whether it's creating fake accounts around these protests, whether it's using the fake accounts for some kind of political astroturfing and trying to create some kind of grassroots activism where there's nothing. That's going to happen, and we just need to keep watching. I think that's going to continue happening. The positive side around this is we've been looking at ways on how can we use the same Gen AI for pre-banking and fact-checking in real time. If you recently watched the US political debates between Trump and Kamala, you may have seen the kind of real-time fact-checking. Imagine that's happening, online around a protest, and a number of bad actors are throwing disinformation, and some of the protesters are countering that back with some, real pre-banking and fact-checking. I think that would be very interesting use of AI in the future. Yeah. Maybe the second question, I forgot about the second question. You want to take that?
Take two more and then
Okay.
we answer them collectively.
Okay, sure.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Omhlen Chingila, and I'm from South Africa. I'm a project coordinator at the Right to Protest Project, which is a coalition of different movements that protects and promote the freedom of expression in South Africa. So South Africa is dubbed as the protest capital of the world. We have close to about 27 to 30 protests that are happening daily, and that we support through our hotline that we run as R2P. And I think my question is two. I think he's already asked the second question I wanted to ask. How do we ensure that research actually gets down to the ground and that information is disseminated in a way that is impactful for change and progress, for the social movements that we support? But also, as you're talking, I'm just thinking, what are some of the threats or other repression tactics outside of surveillance and censorship can you predict that are going to threaten social movement spaces in the next 5 years? And how best can we as projects, prepare social movements and grassroots movements that protest on the ground. I'd really love to hear what are some of those predictions that you have for the next 5 years, especially in our region in Africa. Thank you.
So she raised two questions on threats, predictions that can impact movements. How do we also ensure information gets to the ground? So we can have two more last ones. Yes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Salamoit, I'm from Ethiopia, and my question is about internet throttling, which was mentioned by the moderator. So, in most of events and such as protests or examinations, service provider usually use internet throttling in most part of Africa. So, how can we make these service providers accountable whenever they do this? Thank you.
Okay. Is there a last one? There's lights all over, so now I'm struggling to see you. Okay, I think there isn't any more, so we can address that. Who wants to kick it off? Richard?
Yeah, I would love to take the threats. Let me start with the threats. So we can't talk about the future of protests without talking about the abuse of non-lethal or less lethal weapons like tear gas. Just to maybe share this also, recently during the Reject the Finance Bill protests, my team noticed the really high use of tear gas in many parts of Kenya. If you can search online, we published an investigation that we called Israeli Gas, Kenyan Tears. The use of non-lethal weapons or less lethal weapons as they call them these days, like tear gas and water spray cannons and many others, is a huge, huge challenge. I think just yesterday, the Amnesty Kenya shared a report around the number of people who were killed during these protests. And it's very clear that, the police and some of the, the security organs are really taking advantage of that. And this is an area that really needs to be studied. When we talk about tear gas, there's been very little research done around the health repercussions of tear gas. While performing our investigation, we noticed hundreds of tweets from women that tweeted days after tear gas was thrown in their, in their neighborhoods with challenges around reproductive health. Some of the major threats that we're going to see coming up, in the future, post-protests, could be health challenges based on the amount of, likes of lethal weapons like tear gas that could be used across. There are going to be new levels of surveillance. That's also a threat of its own. Take an example. You talked about throttling of the internet. This time during the Reject the Finance Bill, the kind of throttling of the internet that we researchers saw was very unique. It was just around the city centers. So we are starting to see new behaviors and new threats around, kind of targeted throttling, which is the same way we saw, I think, was it in Hong Kong and some parts of Bangladesh, where many of the authorities could analyze phone numbers that congested within a particular base station and use that to target the individuals who, continuously use them to make phone calls and use them in different other ways. So these are some of the digital threats and the physical threats that I see coming up in the next 5 years. We can never have a conversation around protests without tear gas and surveillance.
You just reminded me about the tear gas. And I remember the tear gas in Nairobi was so bad that 3 days after the day people were protesting, when you went to the city, you would literally tear. 3 days after. So, yeah, I like that you pointed that out and the fact that it's important to look into the health implications of these things. Um,
Maybe just to add on around tear gas, and this is the threat that we are seeing is, you know how Israel as a country has now exported a lot of surveillance tools. Data is showing that they are now growing in the exportation now of crowd control tools. So that's another challenge of its own because it's a huge market. Imagine the number of protests that are going on in South Africa, as she said. They need tear gas, so it's a massive market for them. Just want to add that.
Okay. Can I go ahead and add on? So, I mean, I think Richard has spoken to the threats to physical protests, but I'll speak to online protests as well because I think they still carry the same value, right? So one of the threats that I see happening, it has been happening, but I think it will still continue to happen, is the possibility of internet shutdowns, whether it's a full-on one or whether it's a partial one. We experienced one in Zambia in our last election. I mean, it's unconfirmed a little. I mean, it will always be unconfirmed. But there was a period when we didn't have access to certain online platforms. So I will assume that was a partial shutdown of sorts. No one was responsible for it up to date, but you know, when you know, right? So I think one of the ways that we tackled that lack of access was through VPNs, which I would suggest that all protest groups like R2P also use when they're trying to protest, and they also have to use online platforms. But one thing about it is not everybody knows how to use it, so there's a huge component of digital literacy that needs to come in for you to be able to teach your community on how best to use a VPN and, to still be able to access online platforms if the movement is still carrying on online. I think another threat also is economic challenges, right? Depending on where you're from in Africa, I would sell my soul depending on the day, right? So sometimes you do have people in your movement, and not every movement is well funded enough to take care of everybody that's in the protest team, right? So you find that there are some people who genuinely had good intentions, but hard times fell in them, and they compromise their status with the movement, and maybe they are offered a little something from the opposing team or the people that you're trying to stand up against. So then they shift their loyalties because there is a sort of reimbursement on that side. So that's a challenge, is that you might have a group of 100 and take your really nice pictures, because protest pictures are great sometimes. But by day 2, you're down to 20 because they've been offered a little something elsewhere. And half the time, protests are carried out by people who are facing some sort of real big challenge, and usually there's something financial tied to it. So if they're able to get a quick fix elsewhere, that's a threat also to your movement, is that they end up shifting the goalpost, I guess.
I don't know if we've answered her question on digital authoritarianism, on the whole concept of having, which I think is still going to continue. The typical thing, and it's going to happen, apart from using tear gas, internet will be shut down. It went as far as in Nigeria to ban then Twitter, now X. Of course, based on many other reasons, but the long and short, the basic issue was the role that Jack's Twitter played during the NSAS protest. How do we get tech companies to be much more responsive, even telecommunication companies? In the end, it's just to a more viable civil society. And again, a more viable society that is also built on a strong, so to speak, social movement organizations. Because that's the only way to keep government in check, and then of course, big tech in check. I'll give a typical example. Despite everything, I think Paradigm Initiative took the government to court, and to the ECOWAS court, and got a ruling. And that's the only way to test legislation. whether or not that ruling was made them to unban Twitter is irrelevant, but at least there's a precedence. So because if it doesn't happen, what we are going to see, this cycle will just continue. At the least provocation, the telcos or they get and they switch off, and that's it, and nothing comes from it. And that again goes back to, I think, part of what Richard was saying. You can see that things that we should learn from other social youth-driven movements. The fact that the Hong Kong protesters were wearing black shirts, putting on masks, there's a level of organization. It's not per chance. This type of things don't happen per chance. And that's now where the challenge of youth movement in Africa, going beyond the first stages of mass action to actually building solid movements that have entered the stages of bureaucratization. Because it's only when your movement morphs into that stage that you are now able to really to withstand for the long run.
In terms of predictions, for me, what I worry about is people contending with status quo. I know for most of us, there are certain things that shape the politics of the day or issues around governance in our countries. For my country, politics mostly is influenced by tribal, media, political parties. So one of the trends that we've seen with young people, these are people who don't care much about the tribe that you come from or your political party. People are just big on issues. But my worry is that if these movements if this change doesn't see the light of day, then it's so easy to have this generation regress and go back to the same good old, people becoming disillusioned and thinking that you thought you could change things, but unfortunately you can't. And even when you put yourself out there to agitate for change, only a fraction of people end up benefiting from that. So that's what I worry about. But if that doesn't happen, then I believe we are going to have a really system overhaul. And we can already see some of this in Kenya, where different government agencies are rethinking the way they do public engagement. We've seen our president come to, let me try and call it X now, X space. So for those of us who joined here a bit late, we had the generation like myself who are stuck on calling this Twitter, and there are those who are trying to call it X. I don't know where you fall, but we were having a conversation on impact of the digital media on social movements and the role that digital media can play in bringing impact in this space. I don't know if there's anybody else who has a burning question before we close. If there's a gentleman there with a question, then after that, I will ask my panel to give their closing remarks. There's another one? Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Abdul Aziz Sise. I'm Advocacy Operations Assistant at Africtivist, the organization that co-hosting the forum. So I have a contribution and a question. First of all, I go ahead with the contribution. Us in Africtivist, we believe that there is like no democracy, no good governance without citizen participation. And that's why we try to advocate through digital so that to foster democratic and citizen participation. Because whenever we let people, with the leaders they can like guide them in the way they want. And we, as like citizens, we try to be in the front of that advocate for citizen participation. So here in Senegal, as you may know, we have been passed so many like events, political events, and at the end we have like maintained our democracy. And people believe in democracy whenever they have been guided by their peers. We have to believe in democracy, and we have also to learn and to help each other. We have to learn. If I say we have to learn, is that here in Senegal we learn from NSARS, we learn from not too young to run, etc., etc. And at the same time, like what was happened in Kenya, they learn from Senegal, and recently in Nigeria also they learn from what Senegalese did, etc., etc. So we have to build that solidarity. It may help us so that to really have a strong like citizen cycle, citizen participation throughout our country. And we have to believe in democracy. So what is happening in countries, in IAS countries, the Sahelian states countries, like these countries are led by juntas, and people over there, so the majority believe that democracy does not work for them. We have to let them believe that democracy can work when citizens, all the citizens participate in that movement. And now the question is here, what is the main takeaway we can go with, like with solidarity? Which can be the solidarity we can like build together so that to make the movement stronger? Thanks.
Thank you. There was another gentleman over there. There we go.
Thank you very much. My name is Abdul Salam Waiswa from Uganda. Mine is a contribution. Listening to this discussion, certainly you confirm that we are all pushing for improvement in the digital space and enjoyment of rights to our people online. And indeed, Africa, we need to go through this and empower our young people to utilize the power they have in their phones online to advocate for their rights and make Africa better. But as we do that, it's important for us to also tell the young people that there are certain obligations which they must comply with within the law. Because the challenge is that sometimes when people are working or speaking to one another online, they assume that they enjoy certain legal immunities. So some of them go out of their way to do so many things that are outrightly illegal. They assume that they cannot be identified, they cannot be held legally liable, they cannot be prosecuted. But like our colleague was saying, every time you go online, there is a digital footprint about you. Your phone has your SIM card, there is an IP address to your device, there is records about you. So if the state wants to get you, they can't get you. So my appeal to all of us is that we should be able to use internet as a mechanism, as a road for advocating for our rights within the law. Sometimes the laws might be unfair in the sense that they impose obligations on you to be responsible, not to incite violence, not to publish wrong or false news. Until those laws are changed, they are laws in our countries. And therefore, we must tell our youth the full story, that we have a right to call everybody to work towards changing governments, to bring about democracy, but do it within the law. Because if we don't tell them the full story, some of them will go out of their way to publish deep-fake videos, to publish false news about leaders, to forge all manner of stories and incite people to go on the road, on the street, burn down the cities, and that can cause many of us lose the many benefits that actually we've gotten as a people in Africa. So I think we need to warn them about the responsibility, because in most of our laws, rights have obligations, and they involve being responsible as you use the internet. That, in my view, ladies and gentlemen, we need to embed it in all our conversations with the young people about the use of the media and the digital tools to make Africa better and better democratized. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will allow my panel to make their final closing remarks.
All right. So just feeding into his contribution, right, about how sometimes we forget that our rights online are the same ones that we have offline as well. So whatever you can't do in person, don't do it online, because the same laws will apply to you. And depending on what your cyber acts are in different countries, you know, they might even be worse than physical laws. I don't even know if that's possible. But, and then also just to answer your question, thank you so much for hosting this event with Sepesa, by the way. The whole point around, I mean, you said the key takeaways, right, from this, is that even though one of the things that has been spoken about is collaborating, you know, with other African movements, or sometimes the collaboration just falls into place because it's a global issue that is affecting, you know, multiple people all at once all over the world. But I think there is a need to also keep in mind that while those collaborations are happening with other countries or other organizations globally, there is a chance that the laws that apply to me in Zambia may be slightly different from the laws that are in Uganda, that are in Kenya, that are in South Africa. So maybe there's a lot of liberty that a South African might have when it comes to some of these activities with movements, but in my country there might be some restrictions, so I can't participate to the full capacity that someone with very high liberations or high liberty levels can, right? So maybe there's that consideration that yes, there could be collaboration to effect a super global, powerful movement, but with some boundaries. Yeah.
Okay. To my Senegalese friend, I think that this conversation in itself is among one of the great takeaways in terms of giving this solidarity, because what are we doing? It's a fermentation of ideas, cross-pollination of ideas, and that's the whole essence of this FIFA Africa 24 and previous ones before it. There has to be cross-pollination of ideas, and precisely because of that, gathered up to more than 450 participants across, within and outside the continent. So, is it enough? Perhaps yes, okay, yeah, it can always improve, but that in itself is a step in the right direction. And yes, of course, we have to tell young people the truth. And part of the truth is that social movements are considered and should be considered normal means under the law, under each particular jurisdiction, the constitution of many other, most African countries. In practice, that is a constitutional right to protest and to show dissent. Yes, we're not going to say that, and I think it's a little bit of, I don't know how to put it, to start thinking so condescendingly that these young people are utterly foolish and they don't know their rights from their left. Yes, movements grow. They learn from each other. They learn from history. But the young people we are dealing with are not totally stupid. They might not do the things the conventional way, but they're not totally stupid. Thirdly, yes, okay, they have to act within the law. No doubt about that. No one is propagating anything outside that. But the government themselves as well should give out their responsibility. responsibility that they sworn on assumption of office to provide basic infrastructure for their citizens. You provide it, the young people will not find anything to protest about. The stats are there. 50–60% of young people are unemployed or not or underemployed. Infrastructure is deficient or lacking. There's no hope. In Nigeria, for instance, there's this Japa syndrome in which practically every young person is trying to leave the country